Deborah from the Soundings editorial group, and welcome to tonight's event. It's a launch event for After Neoliberalism, the Kilburn Manifesto, which has been put together by the journal's founding editors, Doreen, Massey, Stuart Hall and Mike Rustin, so as to open more space for creating and debating alternatives to neoliberal culture. Just to say, it's really good to see so many of you here, and sorry that some of you are sitting on the floor. Perhaps if everyone can make sure they're squeezed in the middle. I think we've got a few spaces here and there. But basically we've had a lot of people with a lot of interest in this event. About 280 people have tried to come, and as you can see we've got a capacity of about 100 in this room, so next time we're going to make sure that we get a bigger room, for sure. Now, this is the first part of a 12-month series. The first part of the manifesto is free to download on the Soundings website, though I should also point out that Soundings is funded mainly by subscription, so if you want to subscribe, please do. There are issues here to buy if you want to buy any, and you've also hopefully got a leaflet about how to subscribe. Our speakers tonight are firstly Doreen Massey, Emeritus Professor of Geography at the Open University, and as you probably know, she's written very extensively on the uneven power geometries of our world in books like World City and Full Space. Secondly, we've got Mike Rustin. He's Professor of Sociology at UEL, and he's worked on many subjects including politics, social theory and psychoanalysis, and his books include Reason and Unreason, Psychoanalysis, Science and Politics. Stuart can't be here sadly, but he has got a piece about the manifesto in today's Guardian if you want to take a look at that. After Doreen and Mike, we have our two respondents. Firstly, we have Deborah Grayson, who's currently the campaign coordinator for the Media Reform Coalition. She's also worked at Yes, Prefer a Vote and Climate Rush. And then finally we have Andrew Sims, who's a writer, political economist and environmentalist, who worked at the New Economics Foundation as their Director of Policy for 10 years. And he's written a lot of books, but his most recent book is called Cancel the Apocalypse. So the format roughly is that Doreen and Mike are both going to talk for about 15 minutes each, and then Deborah and Andrew will talk for around 10 minutes, and then we'll open it up to general discussion, because it would be as nice to be as participatory as possible. And we're aiming to finish roughly at about 8 o'clock. We've got a little bit of scope there. Just to remind you, please can everyone turn off their phones? Thank you very much. And I will pass you over to Doreen.
I've been told to stand up, so I shall. I am slightly on the small side. It's good the back can see me. I'm going to start off with the dreaded words Margaret Thatcher, but I promise after the little opening anecdote that will be it as far as the lady is concerned. But I was absolutely gripped in a sense by all the machinations and proceedings that went on around the funeral of Margaret Thatcher. I watched it with a mixture of kind of horror but at the same time total fascination as to what was going on here. And what fascinated me was the attempt, which was so plain, to turn Thatcher into an apolitical figure. In other words, to take what she stood for as common sense, to take what she stood for as a given with which we all agreed, and in that sense to kind of raise her above the level of active political contestation. So it's an attempt to depoliticize an incredibly political figure. Indeed, one of the prime originators of this thing which we're going to talk about this evening, neoliberalism. And it was precisely the attempt to depoliticize, to take out of the realm of political content that was so political about the funeral. And of course it may not work. There was dissent, particularly in the north of the country. There is hope. But it was a very, very interesting moment. Is that it? Anyway, the point is that that attempt at the depoliticization of the political is in a sense absolutely emblematic of what we're on about in the Kilburn Manifesto. That while there is an economic crisis, a serious implosion of the neoliberal economic system of deregulation and privatization and financialization, while that has imploded, there isn't, on the other hand, an equal implosion of the political and ideological common sense that underpinned and went along with that cohabited it, that in a sense made it possible for that economic system to become the thing that we stopped questioning. And indeed, of course, the very economic crisis has been used to reinforce both that consensus and the implementation of the practices that derive from it. So our thing is called After Neoliberalism, and it's one of those weasel words, neoliberalism. For us, what it means is it's about more than economics. It's about, crucially, the forging of a new common sense. A common sense of market relations, competitive individualism, private gain and the denigration of the public, a disregard, a total disregard for the planet. It's altered over, 30, 40 years now. It's altered in very deep ways our sense of ourselves. It's penetrated our imaginations. It's limited the horizons of what we think is possible. It's in many ways, and we talk about this in installments that are to come, it's changed the way we conceive of our own identities. We're customers, not passengers, or whatever. All of those things have retold the story of who we are within society. And it's a common sense that is driven, on the one hand, just by simple, constant repetition, reinforced by powerful media, which is either militantly right-wing or pretty much submissively acquiescent. So it's precisely a common sense that takes itself out of the realm of the politically contestable. So in that sense, the funeral of Mrs. T was absolutely emblematic of what has been going on over the last 30 to 40 years. And what we say, and I don't think this is in any way original, is that last 30 to 40 years can be characterized as a neoliberal social settlement. It's more than an economic theory. And it's radically different from the period of post-war social democracy that preceded it. And our argument is that if things are to change, if we really are going to have a political battle over the current situation, then it's this common sense that really needs to be challenged. Now that's not at all unusual. I mean, everybody says we want the end of neoliberalism. The question is how you get some purchase on that, I think. And as given our skills, given who we are, given our backgrounds and what we can put in the pot, our sense was that if we want to address neoliberalism at this more fundamental level, question its basic founding assumptions, then we need to understand it in a more systemic, a wider historical and a broader geographical context as well. So the framing statement, which is what's come out in this issue of Soundings just now, is about 6,000 word attempt to begin to think about neoliberalism as a social settlement just for 40 years, but as a moment, if you like, in the bigger temporal and spatial sweep of the development of global capitalism. Now obviously I've got 8 minutes left, I think, so there's no way. So what I say is read it, right? And I really do mean that, because it's only kind of getting to grips with that bigger context, both globally and historically, that one can disinter what is fundamental at what level, what has just been the last 100 years, what is deeper than that, what has just been the last 30 years. And therefore, think about what politics are needed at each of those levels. What I'm going to do is just talk a little bit about the more recent history. As I say, we're thinking of neoliberalism then as the kind of term for the social settlement of the period of the last 30, 40 years. I would argue that neoliberalism triumphed in the UK in the 1980s, really, after the final foundering of the social democratic settlement. And there are a number of points that one can draw just from observing that fact. First of all, the very fact that there has been such a change in common sense kind of gives us hope. And one of the advantages of the fact that the three authors who wrote this document are, what do we say, not of the youngest, means that we can actually remember a time when common sense was utterly different. When the things we took absolutely for granted, which were beyond question, were utterly different from now. So we used to believe in inequality without thinking about it. Collectivity was quite a good thing. The public was on the whole a term of approbation rather than a term of abuse. All kinds of things. So in a way that is, I just say that because it gives us hope, right? If it changed once before, it can change, it can be changed again. Just because things look so bloody obvious we forget to question them, doesn't mean that we can't question them. In fact, we must, precisely because they look so obvious. We must question them. Moreover, the second point is that that shift from social democracy to neoliberalism didn't just happen. I mean, especially now, with the funeral I'm not going to mention again, there's all these retrospective accounts of that period of transition. And so, I mean, we get terms like social democracy broke down, it ran into the buffers, it ceased to work, all the rest of it. And the obvious alternative posited in these narratives was neoliberalism. And the way that story gets told, and this is even in the progressive media, I mean, the degree of forgetting involved in the way in which we construct those histories is quite extraordinary. The way that story is told is as some kind of seamless inevitability. Mrs. T solved the problems that social democracy had run into. Yeah? Everyone's writing this kind of stuff now. We all know that trades unions have got too big for their boots. We all know that Labour had too big a share of the surplus of capital, etc., etc. Actually, it was nothing like that at all. The transition from social democracy to neoliberalism was a story of major political struggle. From Allende's attempt at an alternative in the early 1970s in Chile, and the way it was so violently overthrown at La Moneda in Santiago in 1973. Right through, I mean, I was in Nicaragua in the 1980s, I was also in the GLC. I mean, if there was ever a set-piece battle, it was between Thatcher's view of the City of London, little c, as the City of London, capital C, temple of unregulated finance, versus, okay, we haven't got it exactly worked out, but in the radical urban left, in Liverpool, in Manchester, in Sheffield, in London, there were the beginnings of thinking through what other way out there might be from social democracy. We recognised some problems with social democracy, but saw the possibility of another way out of the difficulties that it was facing. So the transition was not inevitable, it was a battle, and there were alternatives. And I say that because exactly the same thing is true now. There's more than one way out of the current crisis. There is always an alternative. We have to construct it, and it will undoubtedly be a battle. But I think we have to think of it in those terms. And thirdly, that highlights something else, and this revolves around the problem of this dreadful weasel term neoliberalism. We've wondered for ages about whether even to use it, but it's what everybody responds to, so we did. Sometimes neoliberalism is used as a reference just to an economic theory. And in that case, the political battle, the political argument is often very much a technical one about how we're going to solve the problems of the economy and so forth. We've tried to broaden it out in the framing statement and in the instalments that follow to be the kind of icon word for this longer social settlement. So it brings in questions of culture, of ideology, of politics, of the way we are as individuals and the nature of the relations we have with each other. But what's actually fundamentally at issue is social conflict, actually. The neoliberal settlement has reasserted, and its whole point, its aim, its raison d'etre was to reassert the powers of capital and of elites. It's about complex class interests. And it's entangled and entailed also the reconfiguration of a whole slew of other social divisions around sexuality, around race, around gender. So what's at issue when we're trying to talk about neoliberalism is not the technicalities of an economic way out of an economic crisis, but huge issues of power, profit and privilege. Because in the end, that's what it's about. And indeed, it's arguable, no, I would argue, that not only thinking about that seamless narrative that we thought, not only did neoliberalism not just take over seamlessly from social democracy, it was a project that actively, in a sense, undermined the post-war social democratic consensus. That consensus, social democracy, was basically a redistributive model. And in a sense, one could argue that it had been too successful in that redistribution. The share of capital and labour had got, as far as capital was concerned, out of control. Too much was going to labour. Redistribution had gone too far. And the attacks upon the system, on the welfare state, for instance, and on the trades unions, and indeed the globalisation of manufacture in search of cheaper labour, which would undermine the labour, the wages of people at home, were all efforts to undermine those gains. So it isn't even true that social democracy simply hit the buffers. It was actively destroyed in various ways. But that also, of course, points to the limits of it. Social democracy, if it cannot seriously redistribute beyond that point, then it is not enough. And that's my last argument, following immediately from the opening example. I think we say all the way through the framing statement, and it comes up in many of the instalments that follow, this is in no way an argument for going back to social democracy in the form that we had it in the post-war settlement. We probably, all of us, remember quite fondly the good old days, and there were indeed many good things about them, and Stuart talks about that in his piece in The Guardian today. But there were many bad things too, and the left, I would argue, was ahead of the right in some ways in the criticisms we were making of some of the forms of state intervention, state control, the centralisation, the lack of recognition of difference. All of those things we were saying before the right about social democracy. But also social democracy, that post-war settlement, took the market as given just as much as neoliberalism does. It assumed there was a thing out there called the market which we let happen. We harvested some of the gains it made, and then we redistributed it. The big difference now is that redistribution in part took place through the state institutions, and the big difference now is that redistribution is off. Sorry, folks. And we abandon, therefore, both the ordinary monetary redistribution and the institutions of the state which made that redistribution possible. And as we've said, redistribution anyway could only go so far. And what's more, that model of social democracy, you have growth and then you redistribute it, relies on the fact that there's going to be growth. And I think not only are we extremely sceptical about the fact that there will be growth of any serious amounts in the medium-term future, we do, in the instalments that follow, argue against that fetishism of growth that dominates the economy at the moment. And that we really have to address that seriously, both as a responsibility to the planet, if you like, and because it's technically anyway out of the question. So we can't go back, and we must invent something new, at which point, of course, we pass it over to you. And I just want to make one final point, because this is a global system. And the repercussions of neoliberalism, and I don't just mean the crisis of neoliberalism, but the repercussions of the system itself on land, on labour, on resources, on inequality, on democracy, absolutely crucially on democracy, have been catastrophic, I think, in many parts of the world. And the globalisation and the voraciousness of the interests that lie behind it have been behind any number of interventions, both military and otherwise, around the planet. And I think one thing we need to acknowledge, perhaps more strongly than we usually do, is the role of the UK in all of this. The role of the UK in the initial invention of neoliberalism, in a sense, and its dissemination, its very active process of dissemination to countries around the globe. And the UK's current role as kind of neoliberal HQ, as a tax haven, as an arms exporter. If we can't just rescue this economy, and it's not just a technical necessity to have an economy less based on finance. It's a moral obligation, it's ethically something we cannot tolerate, to have an economy that we have at the moment with the effects it has around the globe. So it would be, as internationalists, we must address the nature of the economy that we have at the moment. But if it's a global system, then it's also neoliberalism, globally contested in lots of places around the world. And we mentioned some of this in the statement. I mean, obviously, there's the proliferating struggles of occupying indignados, etc. There are, even within Europe, there are parties such as Syriza and others which do question to a much deeper level the tenets of neoliberalism, much deeper than anything we have in this country. And there are also the attempts at alternatives in Latin America, and which are subject to the most vile of misrepresentations and vilifications, precisely, I suggest, because they do, in some way, represent a possible alternative. So neoliberalism must be hegemonic, and as I remember, it's a term we use throughout the document. But the whole point of the concept of hegemony is that it insists on contestability. It's not totalization. The system is not closed. Yeah? So contest we must. And the Kilburn Manifesto is our little stone thrown into the possibilities of contestation. Thank you.
Election of Thatcher and Reagan been transforming and in many ways reversing the compromise social settlement. In other countries it was a New Deal settlement or a Christian democratic rather than a social democratic settlement, which had been set in place after the defeat of fascism by the democracies in 1945, which was in effect its condition. Doreen's talked about the new common sense of individualism, consumerism and markets, which has been used to drive other conceptions and the social good to the margins of public and even private thinking, if we like to interrogate our own minds on these questions. It's necessary to see that the transformations taking place over more than 30 years now pervade nearly every sphere of life. For example, universities, where students now have to treat their education as an expensive financial investment in their own futures, where it was formerly an intergenerational gift, and where universities are becoming ever more stratified, regimented, and business-oriented. Well, the school system, where the intention of bringing about balkanisation through free schools and academies is to destroy the democratic dream of a unified, democratic, comprehensive system which will be good enough for all children. Instead, de facto, selectiveness is being reintroduced, and opportunities will become more unequal than they already are. Or the National Health Service, where again the effect of the invasion of the system by corporate providers, begun, it must be said, by Labour, will eventually, if it's not stopped, be the creation of a multi-tier service in which the most needy will be allocated to a poor residual public provision, as in the United States. Now, the neoliberal system likes to describe itself in terms of free markets, but in reality, as Colin Crouch has pointed out, it's nothing of the kind. Free markets are producers with roughly equal powers selling competitively to inform consumers. The model, if you like, of your local farmer's market barely now exists, or at least are a very minority sector. Instead, our economy is dominated by large, semi-monopolistic corporations who are very often able to rig prices, like the energy companies or the banks with the legal rate, are complicit with corporate malpractice, the four big accountancy firms, avoid paying taxes, Amazon, Barclays Bank, Google, even through the use of tax havens under the British Crown, and which ceaselessly lobby and influence governments to do their bidding. Actually, how brave and unusual it was of Ed Miliband, it must be said, to have stood up to Rupert Murdoch and News Corporation during the phone hacking scandal, given the normal relations between governments and corporations. There is now a fundamental disjunction between the interests of shareholders holding financial assets, which, thanks to deregulation and globalisation, are essentially mobile and liquid, and the interests of employees and citizens in companies' long-term productive activities. Thus, the British economy, as Will Hutton has often pointed out, is being hollowed out of real long-term productive capacities. So it's becoming doubtful whether present standards of living will be able to be even sustained in the medium term. The private sector, so-called, seems to depend more and more on the state to keep it going. Think of the bailout of the banks and the public resources being continually transferred to it through the privatisation of so many services. It's as if British private capital has concluded that it can't actually manage the markets, and therefore going to the state is its best way of staying in business. The market system is further beset by massive market failures. For example, the corporate producers of coal, gas and oil and their ideological allies are able to prevent effective action being taken to avoid disastrous climate change, which will eventually affect even them. A new market failure has just been revealed in regard to the development of antibiotics. It is not apparently in the profit-seeking interest of Big Pharma to research these drugs, so there is a growing risk that bacterial immunity to them will plunge the world back into the days when most infections could not be cured. We think an analysis which connects up all these different aspects of our changing world is essential if we're to find a way of challenging, or indeed even containing, what is in certain respects a totalitarian system. If we can't see it for what it is, we can't challenge it, or develop alternative ways of thinking, feeling and acting within it. Now, ideas and ideologies are only one element of a system such as this, though it's the element which we as sort of intellectuals are best able to engage with, and which our manifesto will be mainly addressing. But we also have to recognise, and this is not a source for hope or optimism, that changes in the balance of institutional and social forces have also taken place. They have been deliberately engineered in order to enforce this changing world order. The weakening of trade unions, the subordination of elected local government to central government, the hollowing out of the democratic mechanisms of the Labour Party, the removal of the relatively neutral space represented by public enterprises, the weakening of social protection for citizens, for example in the housing market and in the attack on social benefits, and the marketisation of the public sector itself, all have the effect and the purpose of weakening the material, cultural and institutional base of social, democratic and egalitarian ways of thinking, and make serious challenges to this system much more difficult than they were in the 1970s or later than that. The main purpose of the coalition's defence deficit reduction priority, for example, is not to avoid Britain suffering the economic fate of Greece, as was earlier claimed, actually by Vince Cable. This was never a serious risk. Britain is not in the least bit like Greece, as an economy or a society. It was and is rather to justify the uprooting of the welfare state in an irreversible way. The government will go on with this project until the day it loses office, since it understands the long strategic game it is playing much better than most of its opponents do. Indeed, one of our problems is that because Labour colluded so much when it was in office with this post-Thatcher worldview, it now finds it difficult to find any firm ground on which to stand against it. The task is now to identify the shape and dynamics of this now dominant system in order to clarify potential developments alternative to it. No one is likely to get anywhere on a necessary journey of this kind without a map, and I guess we're in the process, and we hope you are too, of trying to think about what such a map might look like, within which the political developments, in particular of the next 2 or 3 years, might be thought out. Now, we've no illusions that our manifesto, even with its 12 instalments, we're anxious to develop a process rather than a one-off kind of statement, can do this work alone. The history of previous moments of transition, the road to 1945, as Paul Addison once called it, the emergence of the New Left in the 1950s, even the rise of the New Right in the 1970s and 80s, show us that when changes in political thinking and practice occur, when significant changes of this kind occur, they have many complementary and converging sources. When a difference is made, it's not usually from single interventions, least of all interventions like ours, but from the emergence of many interventions from different and sometimes unexpected sources. If things go well, such initiatives can then find themselves in dialogue with one another and become joined up. We hope that we're at a moment when we can help encourage such new thinking, and that we will find ourselves to be one part of a larger attempt to understand both where we are now and where we might be.
Deborah.
Hello, thank you for inviting me to speak, and so this is a very welcome and very important process, I think. And I especially like in the framing statement the way you talk about having a very specific understanding of neoliberalism, not as a set of abstract ideas, but as a set of always imperfectly enacted policies in very specific contexts. So what I wanted to talk about first was talk very specifically about the UK and British context, and particularly some of the issues that I think are there for younger people. There's been a lot of talk in recent weeks about those of us that were born after 1979 being Thatcher's children. But I actually think in terms of our understanding of politics, we're far more Blair's. I was 12 when he was elected. My family aren't political. My parents never really spoke about Thatcher or Major, let alone John Smith or Michael Foot. And so therefore I really have no political memory of a genuinely contested election in which there were parties offering substantially different proposals. In a sense, I've never known a politicised politics. When Thatcher said there is no alternative, she did it in the face of fierce resistance from organised Labour and from two political parties who between them were capable of polling a majority of the popular vote. Blair didn't even have to say that there was no alternative, just had to gesture towards two other parties who were offering essentially identical policies, and an opposition who were only capable of getting elected when they found a leader who, in the words of Charlie Brooker, was a straight-to-DVD retread of the Blair ascendancy reenacted by androids. When Thatcher crushed her enemies, you knew she was wielding a weapon, and you heard the enemy's pain. When Blair silenced his, it was with a smile and support of the Guardian. Of course, in many ways, this is a similar story in other countries which experimented with third-way social democracy. But I do think the UK is particular because of our centralised politics and because of first past the post, which has led to a particularly acute sense of status and lack of alternatives. For example, in the US, even when there's been gridlock at the federal level, there's always been pockets of experimentation and innovation at the state level. Or in countries like Australia or Germany, where their electoral systems have allowed their respective Green parties to exert pressure on their Labour parties from the left. And as you say in the framing statement, in Britain there is no political crisis to match the economic crisis. There is no viable alternative. Our equivalent of the Five-Star Movement or Syriza is embarrassingly UKIP, who have nothing resembling a critique of neoliberalism in their bizarre manifesto. And of course Blair is still sniffing around the Labour Party, ready to whip Ed into line the moment he looks in any danger of suggesting something actually different. This is not to be pessimistic. I think something has really changed since the 2010 election. Whenever I feel particularly depressed about the current situation, I think back to that stultifying consensus in the new Labour years, and I think at least now there does feel like there is a possibility of change. And I do think for those who have been politicised since 2010, there is a greater sense of movement. But I just want to highlight that part of the challenge in working out what comes after neoliberalism is how to convince people who have never experienced a real choice at the ballot box, who've never actually experienced politics, that conventional politics is a credible vehicle for changing anything. And I just wanted to raise one question, which was, to what extent is this an issue of the left? Or what does being on the left mean in this context? One of the best responses to Thatcher's death, I thought, was what John Harris wrote in The Guardian about the way that Thatcher unified her party by killing off the socially concerned centrist wing of the Tories, which she did, of course, with the help of her friend Murdoch, who helped her redefine what right-wing was as being something which is purely about free market economics. And this process in many ways has been completed with the intake in 2010. So many new MPs, so many of the old guard chucked out with the expenses scandal, and this new intake being almost entirely radical free marketeers like those who wrote Britain Unchained, suggesting we should have 60-hour working weeks, along with the lone voice of the old-style Tory, Zach Goldsmith. But of course this sets up an intolerable tension for Conservatives, because at some point those free markets will destroy your families or destroy your communities. And perhaps one way of thinking about the present moment is that this is actually now becoming as obvious to the middle classes and to Thatcher's working class in the south as it has been to the post-industrial working classes in the north. And of course, if no institutions are sacred, neither is your party. I mean, this intake of Tory MPs are the most rebellious there's ever been, and their members are also expressing their disdain, and their distaste largely by leaving a party which has halved in size since Cameron became leader. And for these Tories and ex-Tories who want something other than free market economics, there really is no home at the moment. Some of them will defect to UKIP, but their rampant libertarianism will obviously do nothing to strengthen families or keep communities together. And I do believe that the moment the spotlight is actually put on their economic policies, and it's realised how out of step they are with their voters, the party will either radically mutate or rapidly see its support ebb away. Miliband's One Nation Labour is obviously an attempt to reach out to these people, as are the various ideas surrounding Blue Labour. And this may well be where an electoral majority and a real mandate to change lies. But this majority won't materialise if in the process Labour is seen to be lurching to the right in the terms set out by Blair, or enacting a programme which is seen as coming solely from a left tradition, which self-identified Conservatives would have to sign up to. I'm not trying to say that political differences don't exist, I'm not trying to say we need to move beyond left and right, but just that we might be underselling these ideas if we see them as solely coming out of a left tradition. An example of this could be seen, last year there was a book published called Regeneration, which I worked on with Ben and various other people who were in the room, which was asking, if we put a generational frame on this crisis, what does this add to our analysis and what kind of solutions does this suggest? And Shiv Maluk said in the preface that the resistance that he had encountered from people on the left, the idea of talking in generational terms, and it seemed to come from both the sense that this was undermining the pursuit of equality in the present, and also that this would be playing into the hands of those who are justifying austerity on the grounds that we must defer our enjoyment now in order to provide a better world for our children. And this seems to me completely back to front. These are the people on the left who want to see a return to the post-war consensus, which, as you say, was itself an inadequate compromise for capital, and based on unsustainable assumptions about resources and growth. If the left cannot support any mention of limiting material consumption in the name of the future, then any equality gain will not be quality that can be passed on or preserved and given to our children. And what kind of an equality is that? As for using the language of the right, if ideas are traditionally associated with the right, such as conservation, heritage, prudence, and so on, can be mobilised to criticise the current Conservative-led government and neoliberalism more generally, then surely that places us in a stronger position, not a weaker one. I don't think that's up there.
Very much, and just to demonstrate a politics of diversity, I'm going to sit down. I'm not going to stand up. I'm a South London boy, so in responding to something called the Kilburn Manifesto, obviously straight up, I have a problem. So I'm inclined to offer up as my response the Balham Instruction Manual, or alternatively the Tooting Common 12-step plan. And it's odd for me. I mean, one of the things about NEF as a think tank, where I'm still do various things, is we really exist outside the whole Westminster thing. We're not an IPPR or a Fabians. We're not about the sort of inevitability of gradualism or anything like that. We're allowed to sort of fly kites and do that sort of thing. So, and whenever I think about Westminster, I'm reminded of that line from William Faulkner's book, As I Lay Dying, when he talks about the dead gestures of dolls. I just have to think about the parliamentary process, and that line comes into my mind. So, up front, in terms of my response, I suppose I have a bifurcation point, an initial and prior bifurcation point, in which I think, which is a starting point for any imagining of an alternative politics. And that is the radical and highly contested proposition that anything we do should be compatible with preserving the climatic conditions in which civilization can exist and hopefully flourish. Now that might sound quite big and quite general. Actually, when you peel it away, it turns into something quite specific and extremely difficult to deliver as a political project. Because if you're serious about that bifurcation point, if you're serious about having a political plan which stands a hope in hell of retaining a climate conducive to civilization, and these are the words which James Hansen uses when he talks about us being on the cusp of losing that position, well, that means you have to achieve some very concrete things in a very concrete period of time, which means all those questions about the nature and the pattern and affordability of your social contract, about the deep infrastructure, rewiring of your economy, become imminent and immediate questions of resource allocation, recurrent spending, and investment. And it means you've got to do things bloody quickly. We heard on the news just this morning, there was an interesting little thing, the Climate Change Committee punting out that UK emissions are up, not down, once you include imported emissions from all the stuff that our politicians feel compelled to promise us. And yet at the same time we had a committee that felt it was inappropriate to shift to a method of accounting for our carbon in such a way that it took account of what our real emissions were for some reasons of political pragmatic accommodation. I should say, I'm not going to talk for terribly long now. I have a long answer, a response to the framing so far, and I know one shouldn't say this, but it is where I've tried to channel a lot of the new economic thinking, and it's the book that I brought out about just a month ago, and it goes into a lot of detail about the financial system, about the food system, about the energy system, ways in which we can reimagine those which are compatible with retaining a progressive, vibrant social contract based upon equality and social justice. So I can just kind of say that and I can park it and move on. What is the nature of the moment that we're in? It's perhaps easy to dismiss things which tend towards suggesting an intense urgency. I gave a talk a little earlier today at IPPR, and I said a sort of similar thing about the sort of bifurcation point in slightly different words. And the response I got from the people in the room at IPPR was much the same as the response we've had from the left more broadly over the last sort of 5, 6, 7 years, or perhaps even longer, when posed with the need for a deep transitional economics based upon real sustainability, well-being and social justice. And that is, well, you know, it's a nice idea, but we can't really have that conversation now. You know, there's this process of infinite deferral, of having to have the conversation that you need to have to preserve the conditions which allow civilization to exist. The IMF recently, obviously you take any of their estimates about what's going to happen in the global economy with a huge pinch of salt. They tend to get them routinely wrong. They do reckon we're going to globally shift back to a pattern of growth at about 3.3% next year, which means that the global economy will double in just over 20 years, and we're already about 50% over what the biosphere can take. How's that going to work? The IEA, in their efficient world scenario, the most progressive imagining of the uptake of renewable energy and substitution of clean fuels and all the rest of it, reckons that takes us to about 3 degrees warming. The moment you get past about 2 degrees, you're stuffed because environmental dominoes kick in, one thing feeds off another. And even more recently, we've had the warning that even of the proven fossil fuels that are in the ground, we can only afford to burn somewhere around about a quarter to a fifth of what we already know is there. And then we've got a chancellor who's throwing tax breaks at North Sea oil and gas and all the rest of it. So the point that Doreen made, and this is a fundamental starting point for any political project, is that if you do not contest orthodox GDP growth, you're not even in the ballpark. Because the best science we have available is telling us that further growth in the OECD is incompatible with retaining temperature rises 2 degrees, or even 3 degrees, or even 4 degrees. And as I said, once you get beyond 2 degrees, you're gone. Where have we got to? Let me read you one short paragraph, see if you can guess where this is from, and perhaps when it was written. A pandemic spreads, and terrorists, indeed, I think some of them have. The one thing they all have in common is that their occurrence will touch off panic, and in some cases hysteria, as a result. These events will also contain the seeds of profit for investors who stay calm and think, rather than panic or run. Now, ladies and gentlemen, that wasn't written at the height of finance-driven globalization. That was published in the Wall Street Journal Guide to Investing in the Apocalypse. It's not made up. It's a real document written by allegedly respectable writers, published in 2011. I would say the scale of the reimagining and breaking out of the notion that there is no alternative, our old friend Tina. Actually, I think there is an alternative to Tina. I thought of Dave the other day. That's daily alternatives vary endlessly, or even George. Green energy offers really good examples. But this notion, this fundamental idea about whether or not we can escape the axiomatic nature of markets, which you speak about so eloquently, and whether or not we can imagine a left which can let go of the comfort rag of believing that even if we set just a few parameters around them, we can still rely on them. My response to that, I suppose, is a way in which we can have a conversation which people outside of the Westminster bubble can perhaps grasp hold of, is to imagine the kind of country we'd like to live in. I went through this exercise the other day. I asked myself, what kind of UK would I like? And I thought, well, I'd like one with a citizen-written constitution. I'd like one where we can take bankers who screw up to court. I'd like one where we had a head of our polity who voluntarily opted to live on the national average wage. I'd like a banking system which is largely mutual and local and with a dual mandate to maybe make a little bit of a profit, but overwhelmingly to feed the productive economy. I would like large, mutually owned or cooperatively run sectors of the economy. I would like a national plan for good living that puts well-being at the heart of it. I would like to phase out fossil fuels in the next 5 or 6 years. Oh, bloody hell, that sounds a bit utopian, doesn't it? That's something to fill out the next 12 instalments of the Kilburn Manifesto, or rather the Ballum Instruction Manual, as I've renamed it. And then I thought, how mad is this? I thought, hang on a minute, Iceland. They've just written a citizen's constitution and put their bankers in court. Oh, that hotbed of radicalism. Germany, they have a local banking system which is largely mutually owned and supports local businesses. In Spain, they have the Mondragon Cooperative. In Bhutan, they use an alternative to GDP. In Nicaragua, they're phasing out fossil fuels. In the Netherlands, heck, the option of a 4-day working week is a standard contractual opportunity, and we know from an experiment in Utah at the height of the crisis that by going to a shorter working week, you enhance people's well-being, lower absentee rates, and radically cut carbon emissions, and you save money. That's something the municipality of Utah did in 2008, 2009, 2010. So my answer would be, and there's a whole load more of these, by the way, I have to go on and on, but I won't, that the alternative is out there. Our job is to stitch it compellingly together. And if we are bold, and if we are creative, and if we let go of the past and start imagining the kind of world in which we want to live, then we will take people with us if you do it convincingly and you do it with examples. My final little note about how we might roll this one out is a more recent thing, and I notice in the current edition there's also a nice conversation about what happened at the Olympics last year. There was a very telling moment in an interview with Sebastian Coe done by Decca Aikenhead in The Guardian, in which he was trying to tease out what the hell this man actually believed in. At one point he said, well, I'm not really very political. I referenced back your point about the deeply political nature of representing yourself as being apolitical. And he said, I'm not really sure if I believe in any particular party. And he said, I'm not even really sure if I believe in government much at all. To which a slightly bewildered Deborah responded, but without the government, we wouldn't have had the Olympics. To which he said, oh yes. That's right. There was a poster, and this is my final little thought, there was a poster on the Underground towards the end of the Olympics, and it was a big one, and it said, thank you to our corporate sponsors. Without you, there wouldn't have been a single pulsating moment for the public to enjoy. And I thought, hang on a minute, is that right? Is that really right? How much did they actually cough up? Well, there was a nice little bit of forensic accounting done on that, and the commercial sponsors contributed about 6% of the running costs of the Olympics. And when we had that revelation, and we were all sceptical, I was hugely sceptical, and there were loads of things wrong with the Olympics, but when we had that opening ceremony by Danny Boyle, when he asked, what's good about the UK over the last half a century? And his answer was the collective achievements of the NHS, the wonder of children's literature, the vigour and righteousness of social justice campaigns like the suffragettes. We took a second look at ourselves, and all that stuff of thinking that there is no alternative to a society organised around the axiomatic nature of markets fell away. And Carol Ann Duffy, in a lovely little poem in honour of some of those things, which was published in one of the national newspapers towards the end, rounded off this with these 3 lines, which for lots and lots of reasons, I'm interested in climate change and alternatives, you'll see why, I thought captured the spirit of what any new manifesto has to capture. She wrote, we sense new weather. We are on our marks. We are all in this together. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you for 4 wonderful talks. We're going to open it up now for questions and discussion. So, does anyone have any questions?
Right, let's go get going then, shall we? Let's start building it.
We're going to take them in batches, so yeah, first. Yeah.
First, just a caveat to say that I feel completely out of my league in terms of the right to ask any question. But whenever I go to any of these talks, I ask a simple question, which is, we're trying to change the basic, fundamental, dominant narrative, the story. How are we going to change the dominant narrative as it is today to an alternative dominant narrative? How do we do that? And as you were talking about the name of the thing, and you were talking about the Kilburn group, and I looked, and I felt like I was listening to Radio 4. And then I started to ask myself, well, who's telling this story? How are we telling the story? Who's we? And are we the right we? And how, when you are in a situation where the internet reinforces prejudice, and media is so controlled by a certain agenda, how do we start to change common sense? And I'd really appreciate some thought on that, because I never hear any coherent answers to that question.
Thanks. Question here.
Would you agree that in order to forge a new forward-looking agenda, or way of thinking, or way of politicising forward, class has to become a secondary issue to consumer consciousness, in that everybody is consumers, regardless of class. And it's not about bosses and peers and peasants, and bosses and workers. It's about what we're consuming and why. Make the class thing a side issue. It's the consciousness that needs to be addressed.
Thanks. Yeah, Liz?
Thank you for all those talks. I was impressed by Andrew saying, the person saying to him, I'm not sure that I believe in governments anymore, because I think that is one of the common senses of those who've been out on the streets rioting over the last 2 years. And it seems to me that it's that is one of our biggest problems. And that leads me to think that there really is, at present, a missing dimension to your manifesto, which is that it doesn't discuss structures and organisations, let alone strategies and tactics. And it seems to me that people don't just identify with ideas, or insofar as we identify with ideas, we're not sure what to do about them. That we identify solidly and lastingly with figures who we think might be able to take those ideas forward. So therefore it seems to me we have to have some sense of either what movement or other organisation structures we think might be growing, like for instance the Green Movement, and how they do connect through to some sort of parliamentary political representation. And that is the area that we think about and beyond the fragments, which is just being relaunched again, and we're having a meeting at the end of next week. And that seems to me something that we must think about here and unite our forces.
Can I just respond immediately? Yeah. No, just we did say, I know you went to at the beginning, that we
It's
did
interesting
say...
why I wasn't, because there was a suicide on the Piccadilly line, and that suicide is to do with the consensus of the moment and all those who are going to be thoroughly neglected and driven crazy. And I did want to point that out at some point too.
It was a suicide, I didn't know what to do.
Yes, they threw themselves onto the line.
But, what I wanted to say was just that we did say at the beginning that the frame, I mean, all we can offer at this point in the framing statement is this an attempt to step back from the immediacy of the way in which we talk about neoliberalism, to do an analysis and to set it in the bigger systemic, historical and global context. So that doesn't mean we don't want to go on and discuss precisely what you're talking about, and we absolutely must, but that wasn't the point of this. So it's not we've missed it out, it's just that we felt partly the first thing we were able to do was that kind of an analysis. So it's absolutely not to deny what you're talking about.
Should we just touch on any other questions or go along?
Yeah. This talks to a number of people, I hope, and I haven't got adequate answers, but there's been quite a few people mentioning about how we engage people. And talked about people who have written off the political as a sphere within which anything can be done. I mean, one thing one might say immediately is by the political, what is often meant there is the party political, rather than political debate more widely. And I don't think what we're doing is necessarily just addressing party politics. It's precisely trying to get out to bigger audiences. So that's one thing. But the other thing is, one of the reasons for that, I mean, it's obviously been vastly encouraged by things like the Telegraph on the expenses scandal and all the rest of it. Not to say the expenses scandal wasn't terrible, but there's been a real attempt to make politicians the bête noire of our universe. But it's also because, as I think all of us say, since that politics are depoliticised, in the sense that it was made into a matter of technology, the techniques of administration. And what we lost, and what I think we use the term quite a lot, and if we don't, we shouldn't, is what we've lost is a sense of passion about politics and of political frontiers, clear demarcations about what you stand for and what I stand for. Things that would really distinguish one from the other. And I think that is a way of re-energising politics. In fact, without it, it isn't really politics. It is just about how do we technically get out of this particular economic crisis. And there's one other thing, which I do think we have to learn, and that is, I mean, to be able to talk to people who read the Daily Mail, really. I mean, the right, and the rest of them, the right is so very, very good at this, about being able to interpolate people on the street. That story, which is so horrible, about and you leave the house in the morning, you hard-working person, and the curtains in the street across the road are still closed, and you know they are living on the dole, and they haven't bothered to go out and be a striving, aspiring working person like you. that touches colours. It makes, I mean, you know, that is why the left and right can become so confused as well. And we, I think, tend to judge people like that because they believe it. How can they possibly think like that? Instead of standing where they are on the street and actually going out on the street in the morning and knowing that there are people on the street that do behave like that. I mean, we have to say that, put ourselves in that position and try and re-articulate the feelings that those people have. Not write them off as lost, not denigrate them as right-wing or hopeless, but learn to stand where they are and speak our language, not our technical language, but put our values into the situation that they find themselves in. And I do think we talk a lot amongst ourselves as the left and tend to denigrate some people who don't get it or seem to have attitudes we don't approve of. But what we need to do very much is stand on the ground and understand why those attitudes are there. So that's one thing. I think just one other point. And this is really a question back because I think Deborah said that you felt like it was a moment when, in spite of the depoliticisation and all the rest of it, that maybe it was a moment for a kind of profound change. And I think our feeling for that came because of this notion, this kind of Gramscian conjunctural blah blah blah. Here we have a real the economic is seriously in crisis, but the other aspects of the society, the ideological and the political and the cultural are not. And if we could jolt a crisis in those other things, make a more general crisis of what are we doing in this society, what is an economy for, you know, what's our culture driving that, a more general crisis of the common sense, then maybe this is a possible moment to break through and produce a bigger questioning. And Andrew, of course, has told us that if we don't, it's an absolute necessity anyway. If we don't, we're for it. So what I'd like to have back in a way is this a moment? I mean, we've said this is a moment for taking a leap. And certainly I'd like to say that to the Labour Party. You know, come on, get a grip. Let's take a leap and challenge the terms of debate. Do people think that's on at the moment? And if so, why? Because knowing why helps us to get a grip on how we do it. So some feedback on that would be really nice.
Well, just 2 or 3 points. I really welcome what Andrew had to say about the value of saying how he would like things to be. I think that's a very promising and important way to raise political questions. We know that some of them will have resonance and will be taken up, and others won't. But if you don't say what you're wanting to say, you don't have a chance. So I think that's very important. I also think, relative to the question of organisation and structure, leaving aside the question of, as it were, what we should do next, I think thinking out those political changes that might create more space for alternative democratic political thinking are very, very important. I mean, Anthony Barnett is here, and he's someone who had, you know, with his people he was working with, one of the greatest successes in relation to, through Charter 88, in creating more democratic space. Unfortunately, that has got becalmed, as we saw, and the electoral reform thing was a disaster, but the question of whether there is anything else that can be done in that sphere, I think, is very, very important. And at the moment, from my point of view, the question of what happens to local government and what powers it has, and whether the restoration of metropolitan counties might create a different kind of mobilisation in the way that, in a way, Scottish and Welsh devolution has done, might be one thing that might be critical. I think that the fact that what we've got, in my argument, my view, is not a market economy at all, but a corporate economy, and that many of these corporations, most of the time, or often are quite unpopular, are quite hated for what they do. Energy companies, banks, you know, pharmaceutical companies, you name it. I think there's a vulnerability in the system in the way that it actually works, and in the discrepancy between the way it says it works, we're all freely competing with one another, and the way that it actually works, which is that small numbers of people with immense power, you know, all the bondholders, whoever they may be, basically holding everybody else to ransom. So I think there's an argument about who has the power and who is misusing this power, which is one that should be made and which we should, you know, try to encourage to be fought for. I think the next election is actually quite important, and I think that the question of what we do to influence the Labour Party and the Green Party, if they can be in the game, to do better than they did before and to understand the importance of what they do at the beginning and not halfway through. They don't do it at the beginning, we saw last time. If they collude at the beginning with the dominant system, they're going to be colluding throughout. So the beginning is important. So changing that agenda or finding some bits of that agenda that might actually produce a change in the temperature and a change in the momentum and in the direction of travel, that seems to me to be very, very important. And one of the things I want to see the manifesto and the associated discussions, such as, we've had very excellent contributions from Andrew and Deborah, is to see a discussion about what they should be doing, going beyond, will this play with the public, won't that play with the public? There's got to be a discussion about what the point of the whole thing is, about where the thing is meant to go, which has to be more long-term and fundamental among those people who are interested in those kinds of discussions. And I think some people are. I think possibly even Ed Miliband is, certainly more so than his predecessors have been. I think the question, the final point I would just make at this point, is that I think the question of how the economy is to be considered is extremely important. And I think there's an issue broader than the issue of, in a sense broader, different from the issue of environmental carbon and emissions and so on, which is that the way the economy is currently thought about by governments, both Labour and Conservative, is completely hopeless in terms of reconstructing the economy of this country. It's thought about in terms of, shall we have a bit more deficit reduction or a bit less? Shall interest rates be a bit higher or a bit lower? Shall value-added tax be a bit more or a bit less? The basic assumption is the private sector does it and the government steps on the pedal a little bit or a little bit not. The idea that the economy has to be planned, that people's preferences have something to do with it, that there need to be institutions which plan it, that things have to be taken into account in planning to do with values, the long-term future, equality, all that is completely gone. We no longer have a system which is capable of planning the economy, even if it wanted to do. And I think the argument that Andrew made about the importance of the broadly environmental and green question should be linked to a bigger question in a way, or another question, which is how do you expect people in this country to have a living? How do you expect them to sustain themselves in the world if there is no longer a capacity to think about how the economy is organised, who has power in it, and what it should produce? So I think there's a discussion to be had there, which in a way takes us back actually to the abortive national plan of 1966, when at least Labour had some dismal idea that economic planning did have something to do with benefit, democracy and well-being. I'll stop there.
As they say in the trade, I'm glad you said that, because that's kind of what we're all about. How to tell a story was the question, and in particular, how to tell a story which kind of leaps over generations. Well, I've got a little girl. She has no memory of Margaret Thatcher or all that, but my God, she's seen a lot of it on TV recently. And she said to me the other day, Daddy, why is everybody being mean to Margaret Thatcher? And I thought about how to answer this question. I thought long and hard about it, and I thought about what my little girl likes and what she does. And I said, well, Scarlett, when I was at school, Margaret Thatcher took my milk away. And she went, right. I think one of the big problems with the in terms of our strategic approach, and this is also something where we can perhaps learn something from the opposition, is that where our neoliberal friends are concerned, quite a few of them haven't actually really noticed that they got it wrong yet. You still get the likes of people like Matt Ridley leaping up and pontificating. Matt Ridley, who he? He's that guy who's a bit of a climate contrarian, and secondly, used to be on the board of Northern Rock. He has a platform in the national media confidently asserting what the hell we should do next. Why should we listen to him? What can we do instead? Well, I mean, a couple of years ago, actually, at the height of the crisis, 2008, got together with people like Larry Elliott, Jeremy Leggett, and Anne Pettifor and some other friends, and we produced a thing called the Green New Deal, which was an attempt to imagine immediate transitionary steps towards an economy which would be more equal, more just, and more environmentally friendly. It was couched in terms of talking to people about fears about their energy bills, about whether they could afford to have warm homes in winter, about whether they could be safe homes for their pensions. There was lots of stuff on the banks mixed into it too. It looked about how you could create jobs by doing what you needed to do anyway, about how you could have a multiple window. It told a story, and it told it very much in in Daily Mail language. Now, that's very much a transitionary arrangement, and we did have the larger imaginings of how we could rethink how, as citizens of an advanced, industrialised economy, we sit in the world, our patterns of interdependence with the global south, for example, and we imagined what it would take to get an economy like the UK to live within its environmental budget in such a way that you could hold the social contract together. And we did a little report called The Great Transition. And the key things we found were that the avoided costs, environmental costs of doing the right thing, plus the added benefits of moving to something like Danish levels of equality and the avoided social costs of high inequality enabled you to reduce GDP, the thing which everybody obsesses about, the growth fetish, in such a way that you could still hold the social contract together. In terms of who are we to ask what, well, we only have our own voices, our own agency, and it's down to us to work out what our best intervention into this broader debate is. So I think you throw your best heart and soul and creativity at it and come up with the best answers you come up with. It's unfortunate, the polarisation in class terms of the debate we're having at the moment, but it's pretty bloody difficult when you've got a government who is fighting an explicit class war. I mean, I say that as someone who doesn't come from the Labour movement. I'm a Green, and I sit there and I can't believe the tone and the tenor of the way that the debate is being managed at the moment. We're having a kind of the rhetoric of class war imposed on us from a Tory government that tries to sit above politics in so many ways. And the reservations about questions of government, I mean, I mentioned Seb Coe just because, the guy sits in the House of Lords. His plaything received billions of pounds of public money, and he sits there and he says, I don't know if I believe in government. What we might do as an alternative, what might be a vehicle for how we engage with this? Well, I wonder, I think if we just root something in Westminster in the parliamentary mechanism, I think we're doomed. I think we're absolutely doomed. We need something which has its own separate centre of gravity, which can nevertheless exert profound influence over the parliamentary procedure. And I'm cautious about saying this, but I think we need something like a confident, radical, progressive equivalent of a Tea Party movement, which gets together, flies kites, has a whole load of chutzpah, and goes for it, and shifts where the centre of the debate is happening by pulling at the margins, the radical progressive margins. And I would offer up as a simple little compass we can use. It all comes down, the neoliberals won because they had a really simple boiled down version, privatise, liberalise, deregulate, blah, blah. I would ask three simple questions of any policy proposal. Is it going to increase or decrease our ecological burden? Is it going to raise or lower equality? Is it likely to raise or lower our well-being? And if you can tick those three, you could probably guarantee you've got something which is going to take you roughly in the right direction.
I was going to say something really quickly on the class point, and that clearly we need to rethink what we mean by work and what we understand by work, particularly not seeing the only kind of valid work as being that which is commodified. So I guess in my imagined future world is one in which you say have a citizen's income, or you have limits placed on what is commodified work, and then you have large amounts of time in which to actually care about people. And that this could be a situation in which you could incorporate those basic working class values, which is even if your paid work is something which is perceived as menial, even if it's not, it's something which is seen as low status, like you are still a valuable part of society, and that you deserve to have a living. And that's exactly what is just so missing from the Labour Party now. Any time, if Ed Miliband goes into the next election with a Shirker Striver banner, then who's going to vote?
Okay, let's get some more questions now. There's one there first.
I was involved in an exercise in a small to medium public service organisation, college, where we decided to stop ourselves in our tracks and ask what were our values. This is something I'd never experienced before, but I thought, okay, this is something we need to do. And we consulted everybody within the college, and then agreed a certain number of values. Then we looked at the organisation and how the organisation works in relation to those values. So, strategic planning, policy, and so on. All were asked the question, do these policies meet the values, or do they enhance the values that we've agreed? Now that was very stimulating to me with regards to this more local, national and global debate. I'll pick up a point that you made earlier about it's all out there, because it's not as though we're pie in the sky here, because it has to be practical. But you take the German business model, you take the Finnish education model, you take the Scandinavian big state, small society type of model, and you think to yourself, well, they seem to work. They didn't really have such a, we had their particular problems, but it wasn't really that bad for them, the economic crisis. And as you say, the current leadership is, I think, is following on from the number of economic crises that have occurred since 1870. They've all recovered in about 1 or 2 years. This one's lasting a bit longer, but they'll hang on in there, and they'll pull it through to a kind of level that's acceptable to them. So I think, personally, it's an organisational thing. It's education, because the next generation, to me, as an educationist in the past, there's no political education in this country other than what kids inherit from their parents, mainly. That isn't part of the curriculum, because if you let teachers get hold of political education, economic education, then it opens the door for left wingers, to distort things from the society we love. So I think education is absolutely central here. And funnily enough, the British Council run where a school gets involved with a school in another Southern Hemisphere country, along the lines of global citizen values. They run exercises and lessons, distance learning lessons, that enable teachers and students to address these global citizen values. And I think that's where we've got to get at I don't know if that's the wrong word, get at, but to provide an education that is about global citizenry, global values from the year dot, irrespective of parents.
Thanks. Okay, I'm going to take a question from a woman. Yeah, at the back.
Hi. I want to ask you about what you see as the role of universities, considering that we're in one. And also, I'd like to discuss that with reference to people say at my stage of career, which is early career researcher, and the precarity of that position in relation to actually responding to some of the framings that you're proposing.
To the chap who was asking about what our story is, I think we've heard a big part of that tonight with the talk about market failure. Now, if you think about the kind of currency and the kind of resonance at the moment that phrases like dependency culture or entitlement culture have with people out there, compared to the resonance that market failure has at the moment. But what is it really that is a problem here? Is it the fact that the market is not delivering us enough jobs? Is it the fact that the market has 5 million people who are not getting a living wage? Is it the fact that we deregulated the housing market and blew up a housing bubble? Is it that the financial markets have screwed us over? What's going on with emissions trading? We've got market failure there. We've got market failure all over the place, but we're not going out and telling that story and reframing the debate in our own way. Probably a lot of people in here write articles. How many have written an article in the last month about market failure? How many of you have posted something on Facebook in the last week about market failure? Or sent a tweet today about market failure? But people are out there doing that about dependency culture.
I've done 2 out of 3 of those. Don't believe in Facebook. Don't believe in Facebook.
Obviously, I agreed with virtually everything that has been said, and yet I'm left with a certain feeling of confusion, because if Doreen emphasized the global and Mike the local, and Andrew tried to put the local in the global, it's still within this kind of discourse story of eternal harmony. Britain is part of the advantage north with the imperial past, part of the changes that will have to happen and have started to happen is not only that no more growth is possible, but also the relationship of what we have and what the rest of the world is going to have is going to change. And people don't give up privileges without a fight, without feeling this kind of existential anxiety that have brought the rise of the extreme right in Europe, but also in the South. I mean, part of the blindness of the left is that they encourage almost fascist religious and political movement of the South just because they are the South, and therefore there will be racists if they will object to them. There is a very complex scenario which involves a variety of political projects of belonging, which involve religion, which involve nationalism, which involve definitely racism and racialization of different forms. And we heard a lot about the economy. We heard that we have to look at it also socially, but there have hardly been, except for generation and class, any kind of intersectional kind of analysis of where and how all these issues should be framed. There are different situated gazes, as you said, to the different participants. And the story has to be dialogical. We cannot just give the answer, a different story which will be homogeneous and the same to everyone. We cannot just erase conflict of interest. Of course, there are some inherent issues that you raised with, also the fact that the resources that the governments all over the world have are about the tenths at best of all the resources that all the corporations have. And what does it mean in terms of any kind of attempt of governability of this issue? It's not just a question if we think the state is important or not, but what is the role of the state in relation to that? And all these resistance movements that have arisen is because this kind of neoliberal story of...
I just wanted to sort of slightly bottle that moment when Andrew was talking about practical solutions and having your own tea party movement. I felt there was a sort of a bit of a frisson around the room, there was a bit of electricity, and I'd quite like to kind of capture that and make sure it didn't go away again, because one of the things I find about coming to discussions like this, which is fascinating, and we have those moments in which we're kind of listening to them, thinking about them, but then afterwards we go away and we go, oh, let's go and see. Yes. And I really, and obviously this is an ongoing project, and that's fantastic, and I know there's a whole project around sounding, which is brilliant. But I also feel like a lot of the people in this room who are going to build that movement, a lot of the people who are going to build that movement are in this room, not the other way around. So if some of the best social movements are made in pubs. So if there's people going for a drink afterwards here or going to the pub afterwards, I'm not offering to convene anything, but if everybody has a practical conversation about what they're going to do next, that feels like it would be kind of a good start. And doing that.
So you're asking if everybody would like a drink?
Can we use the email list from the meeting?
Well, that's what I was going to ask, yes. How does, what's going to be carried in terms of debate on the website? Ben?
Building the website now.
Yeah.
I missed that.
What debates are going to be on the website?
Stay in the room and we'll draw you
What
in.
debates are
Neither one
Yeah,
of
they're
us
going to
to do.
we were going to build forums into Facebook, and maybe that's not the best way if other people have suggestions. But we can put something together.
Okay.
If anyone wants to offer to help on that, that would be great, because we've got no resources.
Okay, I'm going to take two final questions, then we'll hear from the panel before we finish.
Yeah, great. Just one commentary and one question. It's about the issue of having political education in this country. I'm Chilean. I'm doing my research about the Chilean student movement. The students don't have political education at all. That's good. But they are doing and constructing a student movement, a huge social movement for free quality education for all. And the other point is about when Doreen was saying, pick up your point about the differentiations between left and right. And basically, when you you sustain, I probably misunderstood, but you sustain the idea you need to identify what kind of values you are embracing from the left and from the right. But I'm thinking about my own research. When a student began the reconstruction of the student movement in 2000, they were very aware about the issue that they said we couldn't talk about left ideas because in a way we were reducing the scope of this student movement. We invite students to march because they say we want a free public transport, but we didn't put the issue that this lack was because we have a law which doesn't allow this kind of rights. You know, it was a very kind of organic work from below. In 2006, with the feminist revolution, they put the issue about the lack of quality of education, and they put the fact that it was a political issue. In 2012, after the huge demonstration in 2011, they talked about education as a social right, as a public social right, because there is an interesting picture. I'll always use this example where people were marching, and there was a girl with a banner which showed, if at the start of 5 years, why I have to pay 15 years. It was the main issue. And the students were very concerned about this, how to engage those people who were marching in Santiago and across the country, because they were facing huge debt about education. How to engage those people and say, okay, it is about education as a right, as a human and social right. So my question is basically how to start in this country this kind of connections with this political idea without showing people this evidence, because how to engage those people walking every day.
Thanks.
You know,
Okay, final question.
If you want to see a culture of dependency and entitlement, I invite you to look no further than our 4 major banks, our tax-avoiding friends at Vodafone, and indeed at Westminster itself. I think, take it out to them, take it back to them, shove it in their faces. The third thing I'd say is, this is great. We need much more of this, of these kind of initiatives. And finally, my book, Cancel the Apocalypse, is available from Guardian Books, so you don't have to write an answer. Thank you.
Well, I just respond first to the question from the lady at the back about universities. I mean, indeed, how can you imagine a radical movement of any life which doesn't have a major base in the university system? It's quite extraordinary that there were far more momentum and influence from the universities in 1967-68, when the universities were relatively small in terms of the population that they enrolled, than there has been than there is now, when it's a 45% of the young people are in the universities. So this is a really fundamental question of how the universities and their staffs have been fixed in such a way as to depoliticise everybody so thoroughly. And I think that's a very, really something that one should be thinking about. I just want to say a bit about my political horizons in all of this. You see, I have thought, since we started to talk about the crisis in soundings a few years back, I thought it was always likely that Labour would get back into power in 2015. In an odd way, the fact that there's now a fixed election date is a kind of help, because we know what the time horizon is. But I've also absolutely dreaded them getting back and not having the first idea of what they would do. And that we would finish up in an even worse position at the end of it all than we were at the beginning, because they would have shown yet again that there is no alternative, or would have weakly gone down the road of doing the same kinds of things. So I think trying to create both an analysis, ideas, a way of thinking, which suggests the possibility of a different explanation of what's happened and a different story about what might happen, is an important thing to do. But also to create enough noise, to create enough movement outside, that people inside, who are after all primarily brokers, they're primarily trying to manage public opinion in order to achieve some foothold in office, that they would take notice, that it would make a difference. And I think the question of what kind of form such a movement would take, Andrew talked about the Tea Party movement, there is the Five-Star movement in Italy, whose immediate effect has been a disaster because they've actually got Berlusconi back in the bloody government, but still it was an important mobilisation in its own terms, even if, as you might say, rather immature. The question of how one creates some kind of involvement of enough people that people in political parties think, well, these are people we must take some account of. These are people it's in our interest to take some account of. I think that is a fundamental question, and I think that's something we need to be addressing over the next 2 years. Now, what